Everybody, good or bad, happy or sad, has some kind of a Christmas memory. Christmas seems to elicit those in us even without trying. Many of us have unbreakable traditions, things that we have treasured for years. We do them simply because we do them. And Christmas wouldn't be Christmas without that. Many of us travel sacrificially. We make efforts at great expense, and it's not convenient to travel to be with people that normally we wouldn't be around, but are a part of our Christmas celebration and have been for most, if not all, of our lives, and we sacrifice to be together. Certainly the entertainment industry has made a big deal of Christmas through the years. All the different movies and the music, the art, etc., that's connected with Christmas dominates entertainment at this time of year. The retail industry in our economy is very much built around and contingent upon Christmas sales to survive. It's such an integral part of our economy. Keep Christ in Christmas is a beloved slogan by many of us who take the Bible at face value and who identify ourselves as Christ followers, because the culture is so saturated with Christmas, and we grieve the fact that in much of the culture, while Christmas is celebrated, Christ is ignored. And it's even escalated to the fact where in recent years folks have dropped Merry Christmas and replaced it with Happy Holidays. Well, I don't know which holiday they're talking about, but the one that I think is most generally celebrated is the birth of Christ. And we lament and grieve the loss of those values. At the same time, I would submit that Keep Christ in Christmas and the need for that type of emphasis is a silent testimony to the universal impact of Christmas upon the culture and the overwhelming impact. Having said that, I'm always intrigued by the relative impact in the church and the culture of Christmas versus Easter. I'm not sure that everybody has an unbreakable Easter tradition, or many people sacrificially travel to be with people they're not normally around on Easter. Other than maybe Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments or an occasional movie about Jesus, there's not much in the entertainment industry that is devoted to the celebration of Easter in relation to the death, burial, resurrection, suffering, torture of Christ. Keep Christ in Christmas is a beloved slogan, but I've never heard anybody lament the fact that we need to keep Christ in Easter. Never heard anybody complain because it's not as universally impacting upon our culture. I say that, and I compare that relative impact because it's intriguing. How many of us have ever gotten and looked forward to Easter gifts and Easter presents? Well, I see that hand. Few of many. Why do people prefer Christmas over Easter? I don't have an answer, but I think it's a fact that more emphasis, even in the church, is on Christmas rather than Easter. Easter focuses on the betrayal, the arrest, the torture, the condemnation, judgment, the execution, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. It seems that typically Christmas doesn't. However, if you compare these two major seasons in the life of Jesus when he was on the earth, 4 books in your Bible tell the story of Jesus, their biographies of Jesus. They are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Good. Get your star when you go out today. However, of those 4 biographies of the life of Jesus, only 2 of them include the story of the birth of Jesus. That would be Matthew and Luke. Mark and John have no mention of the nativity, the birth of Jesus. They don't mention it at all. But all 4 of those biographies of Jesus' life have extensive information about the things that we celebrate at Easter. All 4 of them have extensive information about the betrayal, the arrest, the trial, the torture, the trial, the condemnation, the execution, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, John, for example, if you read in John, which has 21 chapters, you find that the first 12 chapters of John cover the first roughly 33 years and 51 weeks of Jesus' life. From chapter 13 on, and even 4 chapters covered the discussion around a table one night. So condensed is the focus of John that half of his biography of Jesus is devoted to the events of the last week of Jesus' life. He says nothing about the birth of Jesus. So I'm contrasting that to the relative emphasis that we both in the culture and the church place upon each of those. Paul, arguably the greatest missionary, the greatest theologian in the history of the church, and wrote extensively in the New Testament, but he doesn't talk about the birth or tell the story of the nativity of Jesus. But Paul does say in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4, he says this, I passed on to you as most important. In other words, of all the things I said, here is what was most important. Read it with me. I passed on to you as most important what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that He was buried, that He was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. So Paul says that the message of what we celebrate at Easter doesn't mean that what we talk about at Christmas is unimportant. He just says that the information about Jesus that's contained in the story that's related at Easter is most important. Jesus Himself repeatedly predicted His betrayal, His crucifixion, and His resurrection. But Jesus never talks about being born in Bethlehem. He never recounts a story that Mary and Joseph might have related to Him. Jesus doesn't ever mention being born of a virgin. He doesn't mention that. But does Jesus ever tell the Christmas story? And if He does, what does it look like compared to what we emphasize? Not that what we emphasize is wrong, but what does Jesus emphasize that we don't? What does He include that we leave out? And what is it about His version of the Christmas story that we need to remember in order to really celebrate Christmas according to Jesus' version? We're talking this month about who is Jesus according to Jesus. And today, we're going to answer that question from the perspective is what is Jesus' perspective on what happened to Him at Christmas? And how can that help us celebrate Christmas the way Jesus would like us to? What is the Christmas story according to Jesus? Well, there are many, many places we could go in the Bible to answer that question. But today, we're going to go coincidentally to John chapter 10. And we're going to look for an answer in there in John chapter 10. And in John chapter 10, we're going to begin with verse 22. And it says in John chapter 10, it's during Jesus' ministry in the last 3 years of His life. It says, it was at the feast of dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter. Now, the Feast of Dedication is another title for Hanukkah. It's another title for Hanukkah. And it so happens, coincidentally, that we are right now in the middle of Hanukkah. Hanukkah started last Wednesday. And it's an 8-day celebration. Because Hanukkah is the anniversary of, in 165 BC, the temple in Jerusalem had been defiled by Antiochus, a foreign leader who had conquered Jerusalem, and the temple had been defiled by the sacrifice of a pig on the altar. And Maccabeus, Judas Maccabeus, was a zealous Jewish man who led the Israelites in the overthrow of the foreign occupants and invaders, and recaptured the temple and re-purified the temple. That's the reason it's called the Feast of Dedication. It was a rededication and a purification of the temple. And Hanukkah is a festival of lights because the great menorah in the temple, in the part of the rededication, miraculously stayed lit far beyond what any known source of fuel was available for the menorah. It was supernaturally lighted in the temple. And that's where the celebration of Hanukkah comes from. And Jesus celebrated Hanukkah every year, and He celebrated it. We're at the anniversary. He celebrated it right now during this time of year. This is the annual anniversary of Hanukkah. So the events that we're reading today occurred approximately 2,000 years ago in this same time period. At the Feast of Dedication, and it was winter. That's a little insight that tells us that when John wrote, he was assuming that Gentiles would be reading his book. Why? Because that would be like saying to you or me living in North America, it was at Christmas time and it was winter. I think you know Christmas is at winter, right? But people who wouldn't have been Jewish, who didn't celebrate Hanukkah, wouldn't have known when it was. So he was anticipating Gentiles reading his book. It says, at the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem, it was winter, and Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. So Jesus was in the temple celebrating Hanukkah. Then the Jews surrounded him and said to him, "How long will you keep us in doubt? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." Notice what they did. They, like a mob, cornered him. He was cornered and hemmed in by this crowd of people on Solomon's porch in the temple. And notice what they're asking. That same question that plagued him his whole life, the question that was always the question, that's still the question today: Jesus, who are you? Who do you claim to be? Who do you claim to be? That was the question that even his executors, by virtue of the Romans, as they delegated that responsibility to the Romans, the Jews and Pilate, who put him on trial, that was the question they had. Who are you? Who do you claim to be? That's the most important question you need to answer in your life. Who does Jesus claim to be, and do you believe Him? And if He really is who He claimed to be, and you claim to believe Him, what implications does that have for your life? Most important question. And they're asking Jesus, "Who do you say you are, buddy?" So Jesus answers, verse 25, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness of me. But you do not believe, because you're not of my sheep. As I said to you, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. But I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall anyone snatch them out of my hand. My Father," notice my Father, unique relationship. Jesus called God His Father, personal pronoun my. He told us to pray, "Our Father not my Father. Only Jesus can refer to God as my Father in heaven. My Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of my Father's hand. And then look at verse 30. I and my Father are one. I want to submit to you that that verse is a powerful statement that Jesus made, and I'm intrigued not just by what He said, but by what He didn't say. If you were asked by somebody, who are you, how would you answer? Well, there's a number of ways you could answer. But somewhere in that answer, you would identify yourself, even by your birth name, as your last name is from your parents, you would identify yourself in some way based on who your parents are and your heritage. That's critical to our identity, is it not? Notice what Jesus didn't say. Jesus didn't say, well, I'm Mary's son and Joseph's stepson of Nazareth. He didn't say that. That's probably what would be somewhere at the top of the list for you and me, but that wasn't what Jesus said. You see, in Jesus' version of the Christmas story, and I believe that's what this sentence is, it's a sample of Jesus' version of the Christmas story. He identifies Himself as one who has origins in God alone. He identifies Himself as the one who has a unique relationship with God and who has come to this earth. I and the Father are one. I want us to look closely at that for a minute. Bear with me. Don't tune me out. Listen. This isn't real technical. If I can understand it, it can't be technical. Okay? So it's not hard. But this is a critical statement. Let me break it down, because in the original in which the Bible was written, this is the English translation. In the original, we gain great insight into who Jesus is and who God is. The last two words in this sentence are one. Actually, the way the words are arranged in the original, it reads like this. I and the Father, one are. I and the Father, one are. That's the word order in the original. But those last two words, one and are. One is an adjective, and it means one. But it's interesting, the gender of that word is neutered. Now, Jesus is a masculine personality. The Father is a masculine personality. And usually when you use some word to modify another word, then they usually would match in gender appropriately according to grammar, would they not? Here's the bottom line. You don't like to be called it. Pastor Chris, it's a good music minister. It's like Cousin It on the Addams Family or something, right? Remember that? That would be offensive. Why? Because it agrees it would be he. Well, normally, because the Father is a masculine personality, Jesus is a masculine personality, then a masculine form of this adjective would appropriately be used. But it's not. It's a neutered form. And what that's saying is that this oneness is something that transcends their person per se, in the fact that they are not a simple unity. They are one in their essence of their being. Let me read the notes from the New English Bible translation, the translator notes. It is significant in assertion this phrase with Trinitarian implications. One is neuter, not masculine, so the assertion is not that Jesus and the Father are one person, but one thing. Identity of the two persons is not what is asserted, but essential unity of essence is what is asserted in this term. Furthermore, the word are is very important. Are is the word I am. It's a verb, I am. That would be the first person singular version. But in this case, it's first person plural. And what's first person plural? We. I and the Father, one we are. That's what Jesus says here. So He identifies the distinction of persons of He and the Father, but the essence of their being as the same. That's exactly what Jesus is saying here. This is the reason, since Jesus said this, later on, many years later, probably 60 years later, when John wrote this biography, as John recalled Jesus saying this and other statements like it are why John could say in John 1. In John 1:1, John could say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. You see, that's exactly what Jesus is saying about Himself in John 10:30. And then, in case we doubt who the Word might be, John goes on in verse 14 to say, read it with me. The Word became flesh and took up residence among us. We observed His glory. The glory is the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. So you see, what Jesus is saying here is this, is when I came to this world, I didn't just begin to exist. I have always existed as God, and I took on this body, and God came to visit you when I was born in the manger in Bethlehem. That's what Jesus is saying about Himself. But in case we don't buy maybe the grammatical evidence, maybe John's statement in John 1's not enough, well, let's look and see what Jesus' enemies have to say in response to that. As soon as Jesus said that, how did His enemies respond? Because if anybody, it would be used to confirm something, it would want it not to be true. If it were, would be your enemies. Look at what happened. As soon as Jesus said, I and the Father are one, it says, again the Jews picked up rocks to stone Him. Jesus replied, I've shown you many good works from the Father. Which of these works are you stoning me for? We aren't stoning you for a good work, the Jews answered, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God. They knew exactly what Jesus was saying. And that's what we just demonstrated from the text itself and from the affirmation of John. And the enemies themselves wanted to kill Him because they knew Jesus was claiming to be God. They just didn't believe Him. And they knew that the first commandment was, you shall have no other gods before me. And they believed that anybody that broke that commandment deserved to die, and they believed Jesus was breaking it in front of their very eyes. They didn't question what He was saying, nor did He. They just believed He was lying. And what proves that they didn't question what He was saying? Look at the rest of the response of Jesus in verse 34 and following. If you read the rest of the exchange, Jesus doesn't say, now wait a minute guys, you need to understand, you misunderstood me. I don't want to break the first commandment. I know there should be no other gods. And oh, by the way, I'm not God. You misread me. Let's get this straight. No, He doesn't do that. He actually goes on and affirms what they say and reinforces, or what He said, and their accusation. He reinforces it. It's just like when Thomas, you remember doubting Thomas? You remember the story of doubting Thomas after the resurrection of Jesus? Remember that? He said, unless I see Him and touch His scars, I won't believe. A week later, Jesus appears to him. And what happens in that exchange? Jesus shows Himself alive. How does Thomas respond? Thomas says in John 20, Thomas responded to Him, what? What did he say? Thomas called Him his God. Thomas called Him his God. Well, look at how Jesus responds to that. Jesus said, because you've seen me, you've believed. Those who believe without seeing are blessed. He sat there and called Jesus God. Jesus didn't correct Him. Jesus affirmed it. Who did Jesus think He is? I don't know the answer as to why we're enamored with Christmas over above Easter, but is it possible that we're enamored with Christmas because we don't see it as threatening? I mean, the idea of a baby being born is touchy-feely for everybody. But understand, whenever Jesus told His version of the Christmas story, it eventually got Him killed. Maybe we're forgetting something Jesus knew, that the real story of Christmas includes not just the birth of a baby, but the presence of God. And those who hate God aren't happy about that. And they perceive it as a threat. Mark 14, Jesus is on trial for His life. And the high priest who ended up, these people had the power to get Jesus killed. The high priest stood up before them and questioned Jesus. Do you have an answer to what these men are testifying against you? He asked Jesus. But Jesus kept silent and did not answer anything. Again, the high priest questioned Him. Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? There's that question again. Isn't that what they asked Him in John 10? Same question his whole life. Who are you, buddy? Who do you claim to be? Are you the Messiah? Jesus replies to the high priest, I am. And all of you shall see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power of the coming with the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, why do we still need witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned Him to be deserving of death. You see, even now, you're probably saying, boy, you know, Christmas is like, I mean, we had the wonderful choir music and the wonderful drama and everything, and man, you're just pouring cold water on everything. I mean, Christmas is fun, joy to the world. And you're talking all about this. No, what I'm suggesting to you is that is the point. Is that we tell the version of the Christmas story that we highlight and popularize, and I think we forget the ultimate Christmas story, because eventually that Christmas story got Him killed. And that's what makes Christmas all the more amazing, because He didn't back off of it. He stayed with it. And He didn't compromise it. I'm telling you, Jesus was the bravest man who ever walked this earth. I think one of the saddest exchanges in the Bible is found in a verse we read a few minutes ago, John 10:25. If you are the Messiah, they asked Him when they had Him cornered in the temple, if you are the Messiah, tell us plainly. And then Jesus says, I did tell you, and you don't believe. This church exists to help people avoid making that deadly mistake. Jesus has told us who He is. You have a choice to either believe Him or believe He's a liar. I believe Him. You see, as we read the story of Jesus, when He tells the story behind the story, the real story of Christmas, that God became man. As we read the story of Jesus' version of the Christmas story, we observe that when people really understood who Jesus said He is, they either wanted to kill Him or worship Him. And that was that way from the very beginning. Remember the story. We had the dramatization this morning of the wise men coming to worship Jesus. Do you remember what they did? They came from the east and they went to the King Herod. And they said, we're here to search for the King of the Jews. Oh, come tell me about it when you find Him. I want to worship Him too. Lie. Right? What did he want to do? He wanted to kill Him. And he tried to do that. And a lot of innocent babies died in his effort to get to Jesus. Mary and Joseph, as soon as the baby's born, they've got to hightail it to Egypt. They got to get out of Dodge to save his life, because from the very moment he was born, based on the testimony of the wise men, people were trying to kill him. Not just people, not just anybody, but the most powerful man in Judea. On the other hand, look at the shepherds. What did the shepherds do? The angels announced to the shepherds who Jesus is. What did they do? They came and worshiped. Folks, I'm going to tell you today, it's still the truth. It's still the same. People who don't believe Jesus, who think He's a liar, would just soon get rid of Him. People who believe Him, worship Him, and follow Him. It's no different. That message still is real and true and provocative, because Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. You see, you can't really understand Jesus' version of the Christmas story and not choose sides. One either loves Him or hates Him. There's no middle ground. Whose side are you on? Lord, You said, I and the Father are one. Your enemies recognized that You were claiming to be the God-man, and they tried to kill You. We regret that. We regret that ultimately You allowed Yourself to be tortured and murdered so that our sin could be atoned for. Lord, thank You that that's done and over with, because what we want to do right now, we sure don't want that mistake to be made again. We want to exalt You and enthrone You as Lord, not just of Deltona Alliance Church,